Perfect.
Well, hello, everybody. It's John Reed, the Storyteller Fellow here, leading this podcast today, where we shall be meeting Mr. Dean Fox and talking about his inspirational moments and what he's been going through. I am acting today as the podcast host on behalf of Motivate Magazine. Where we're going to put it where you can see it. Motivate Magazine had a special copy for inspirational men. So it's men only, of which Dean was one and I was another, but there were plenty more. So this is a brilliant magazine to read, and it gets men out of their comfort zone and into an area that perhaps hasn't been pursued very much in the previous past. So it's an absolute delight to have you with me today, Dean. Thanks for finding the time. And I know you're in America and I'm in England, but let's do what we can to bring the two continents together.
Indeed, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
No, that's no trouble at all. It's no trouble. It's early evening here. It's dark out in the back garden. I'm in my summer house, which is adequately heated. God knows what it's costing. But yeah, there we are. So I read your story, Dean, and it fascinates me. So you are the first multi-million property entrepreneur I've ever met, or should I say X?
X, yes.
X. Okay. So I'm intrigued as to, well, I've always wanted to ask a person that's made a few, Bob, how'd you do that? Because I've never done that in my working life. How'd you do that? You know, did you get a leg up in the beginning, or were you a self-made man?
No, certainly self-made. You know, my journey into property came almost by accident, essentially. So I read a book called Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And if you've not read it, Robert Kiyosaki talks about the movement from being a business, being in the, he has different quadrants. So he talks about being an employee, and then moving from being an employee to maybe a business owner and an investor. And it really kind of inspired me to want to do something outside of being an employee. Mm-hmm. And at the time, we lived in Scotland, my wife and I, as part of my career, my corporate journey, and we were looking to move back to the Northeast. And so we sold our property in Scotland. When we moved back to the Northeast, we made a decision that we wanted to fulfill a dream, which was to build our own home.
Okay. And
that was the starting point. So we fell into it, as I said, almost not by design, in that as part of our journey to build our own home, we didn't want to buy a new home. So we rented somewhere with a plan that we would stay there until we found a plot of land and worked our way through that process. Unfortunately, we were only in there for about 10 months, and then the owner decided to sell the property that we were renting. And so we had to find somewhere, and we had to find somewhere fairly quickly. And we ended up finding a small terraced house that needed a significant amount of work, but it was somewhere that we could purchase and move in quite quickly.
Okay.
So we did that, refurbished it, and then while we were doing that, we came across a building plot, a plot of land. And so we were in this dilemma of, well, this is what we always wanted to do, but we've now in this home, what do we do?
Yeah.
And so we got some financial advice, and there was an opportunity for us to be able to rent out the property that we'd refurbished and get a mortgage in order to build the new property. And so that's what we did. And that started our journey. And then it just kind of snowballed from there, really. It was like we really enjoyed it. It was really exciting. And it was the right time, I think. We started that in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of a good time to be involved in property.
Yeah.
Not so much later on.
Yeah. So fame and fortune was thrust upon you, really. You were lucky, right place, right time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I must say it's something I've always wanted to do. I live in Kidderminster in Worcestershire, and there are many self-build houses around here where people join in groups and they physically build their own. They don't just employ a builder. They go out and they learn plastering, and they learn all manner of different skills, and then they build a house. I don't know, it still goes on actually, but it did do when I moved up here, an awful lot of people. And I can see the financial sense of it. And I can see, thanks to programs like Homes Under the Hammer in the UK now, many, many people are thinking, hey, that's quite a bandwagon. We can make a fortune there. But it happened to you before all that started, I suppose. So yeah, how big an empire did you eventually get to?
So we didn't have a huge employee, if you like, but we had the site that the development, we ended up more in development than investment. And we, in end of 2007, early 2008, when just before things kind of collapsed,
Yeah.
We were just about to embark on what would have been our biggest development, which would have been probably a gross development value of somewhere between 2 and 3 million.
Okay.
About 5 or 6 properties, fairly large properties on a so it would have been almost like an estate, a small estate.
Yeah, small estate.
So that's kind of what we would have that's the level we were at by then. But it all went away.
And then fate took a hand.
Yeah.
So this is where financial planning and all the rest of it is thrown out the window, isn't it? Because the events happen that you've got no control over. You didn't cause them, and you are reacting to them. And that's not the way to make money, is it? You need to be in control.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I think that the time scale, sometimes when things happen, they happen over a period of time. So, the property market always has ups and downs.
Of course, yeah.
But usually they're over an extended period of time. The dip takes 2 or 3 years to happen. The recovery takes another 2 or 3 years, and then, it builds. And you can usually ride out those periods. The problem was in 2008 that, it was literally like somebody switched the tap off at one night and didn't turn it on the next day.
I remember it happening, and not to me personally, but I remember the period of time that you're referring to. And yeah, I was in a new career as well. I was an energy surveyor, EPCs and all that stuff,
Yeah.
So that certainly impacted my working life, and I had to go out and do other things like driving vans and, whatever, because at the end of the day, you've still got the bills coming in, haven't you?
Absolutely.
So this was exactly the position you were in, and you had to find a way out.
Yeah, we looked at, as many options as we could at the time. And I made a decision at the back end of 2009. So kind of 12 months, we'd survived for about 12 months, but we were rapidly getting to a point, as you pointed out, without any income coming in, but all the same outgoings.
Yeah.
Where, all the money that we potentially made in the previous few years was just dwindling away.
Yep.
And we were getting to a point where I couldn't see us lasting any more than another few months. And I said, well, I need to make a decision. The decision was I was just going to go back into the corporate world. I had a career in sales and marketing.
Yep.
And so I made a decision that's where we were going to go back to. And I didn't think I would walk straight back into the level I was at before, but I was fairly certain I would be able to secure a job that would give us an income. So that was the decision. So in early 2010, that's what we decided to do. And I started to reach out to some connections that I had and look for opportunities.
Yeah.
And then in March of 2010, my wife, myself, and my youngest son were involved in a road traffic accident, car accident.
Okay. How serious was that?
Fairly serious. It took about 2.5 hours to cut us from the vehicle.
Okay.
And
was it your fault, or did somebody hit you?
No, somebody hit us. We were just involved in the accident. It was about 5 cars involved. Unfortunately, we were probably the most badly injured, but certainly the vehicle was most badly impacted, and that put paid to my plans effectively of going and getting a job back in corporate.
And did it give any of you long-term injuries, or was it broken bones?
Yeah, I mean, my wife, she broke her wrist, fractured some of her fingers, broke her lower arm, fractured her sternum, and also had some longer term kind of whiplash damage from the thing. I shattered a collarbone, broke 2 ribs, punctured a lung, fractured my sternum. My youngest son was, in relative terms, appeared to be the least injured, but actually was the most serious. So he broke one leg, but he broke it in 4 places, and it was broken through the growth plate. He was 15 at the time. So it was broken through the growth plate of his ankle,
Right.
and his leg became trapped underneath my seat during the accident as the car was compressed.
Okay.
And so for that a good 2 hours, almost 2.5 hours, he had his leg trapped and had no pulse to his lower leg. So they were really concerned he was going to lose his leg.
So as a parent, you've got a number of problems going through your head, I take it, at this time. Your health, your wife's health, and perhaps I would suggest at that stage, more concerned about your young man.
Absolutely. And you know, my wife took the brunt of a lot of things. She really struggled with post-traumatic stress after the accident, but she was the driver of the vehicle. And I spent about the first hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes of that period just in and out of consciousness.
Yeah.
So there was times when I would come around and realize what was going on and, you know, become anxious, but I would just drift back into loss of consciousness again. But the concern was for him at the time. I mean, he's recovered remarkably well. You know, the team on the day, first responder team, the air ambulance that took him to the hospital, they did a remarkable job at the roadside. They reset part of his leg there and then at the side of the road. Yeah. And then, you know, the follow-up treatment and thing in the hospital, they were amazing. I couldn't fault them at all. They've been phenomenal.
So you learned a lot at this point, I'm assuming. You learned what pain is.
Yeah.
You learned what exterior events can happen and affect your life and everybody else's life in the family.
Yes.
You learned a coping mechanism, because you'd have to cope some way or another.
Yeah.
And when you eventually all got better, was there a job waiting for you?
Well, what happened really was as that year progressed, 2010, from me personally, so there was obviously the ongoing issues around health and physical recovery. So we spent another 9-10 months in rehab and various other bits and pieces. The biggest thing for me was that that meant I couldn't work essentially. In the job I was going back to. I couldn't drive. They took my license away for that period because of the injuries. And I from a mental health perspective, I really, really struggled. You know, all of the things that I suppose that we pick up as men around, you know, being the head of the family and the provider and all of those things. You know, I really struggled with that whole period, not being able to do anything essentially. And then we had the ongoing issue that we still weren't generating any revenue and we were still bleeding money. To the point that I made a decision that I took some advice. I went to see somebody and they were like, look, there's a risk here that you will lose everything. And so we need to act fast and we need to think about the situation. And my decision at the time was, look, I'm prepared to lose almost everything. I promised my family that the house we were living in at the time was the one we built. It was our dream home. And I said, look, if I can save that, then I'll forego anything else. And so I ended up personally bankrupt, and we more luck than good management at the time. That meant we lost lots of the things that I had my name on. So the business went, we know the cars that we drove, they all went. Some of the other properties that we had, they all went. But the home, because of the way that we were doing lots of different property deals at the time, when we were building our home, we applied for the mortgage, and our broker at the time, our finance broker, had called me and said, I need you to sign some paperwork. And I said, look, I'm on a site somewhere in the Northeast, just get my wife to sign them. And he said, well, if only she signs them, I can only put it in her name. And I said, well, I'm not bothered. And he was like, well, I'm always worried about, something happens and then she's got the house. And I said, look, that's not the way we do things. I'm okay with that. Just get her to sign them. So he did. So the house was in her name.
Oh, fortune smiled.
Otherwise we would have lost everything. But the onset of that kind of ongoing mental health and depression left me in a situation that I really struggled towards the end of 2010. And as we approached the Christmas period, so this time of year, kind of 2 weeks out, we were facing a Christmas. We had a young family. You know, I didn't know how we were going to get through Christmas effectively. And I got up one morning and I said to my wife, Christine, I need to go and clear my head. I'm going to go for a walk. I need to think about where we are, what we can do, how we move forward. And I tell this story openly. That was a lie. I had no intention of coming home that day. I went to some woodland near where we lived, and I made a decision I wasn't going home. I was going to take my own life.
Okay.
And there was something that happened, and I used to find it really difficult to describe what this was like. But the best description I've come up with was that when I made that decision, there was lots of thoughts going through my head. But when I actually came to the decision that I see no way out here, I feel is my only option. It was almost as if somebody or something kind of lifted all of that stress and worry and pressure off and kind of almost said, look, I'm just going to give you a few moments of quiet for you to think about this before you do anything.
Yeah.
Because when I made the decision to say, this is what I'm going to do, it was almost as if all of that fell away. It was the calmest I'd been. It was the most at peace I'd felt. It was the most serene moment. Everything was quiet and still. And I don't know whether that lasted for a few seconds or, 10 minutes, but that's just how it felt. And the thing that kept coming up in that space, that time, was this idea of, I could have died in a car accident 9 months ago. In fact, everyone who witnessed that said there was no way we should have survived. And if that's the case, I did survive, then there has to be a reason for that.
Yeah.
There must be a reason why I've gone through all of this stuff. So it was almost like I felt to end it now wouldn't give me the answer. And I really felt like I owed it to myself. It was nothing to do with anyone else. I didn't have any intention of going on and doing anything with the information. It was just, I need to figure out for myself why I'm here. Why am I going through all of this? And that's what brought me back.
It's a fascinating story. And the more you tell me, the more questions I think of.
Yes.
May I ask you, are you a religious person? Do you think God was looking down on you that day?
So I grew up in a religious family, but I've never described myself as a religious person. But I describe myself as a spiritual person.
Okay.
So I do believe that there is something, whatever that something is, that is bigger than us and beyond us and has a much bigger impact on our lives than we imagine. And the reason I say spiritual rather than religion is that usually when people say religious, it's connected to one or more religions.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily go to any one of those or go to church, but I do certainly believe that there is something. And I do believe that on that day, there was a reason why we were saved on that day for some reason.
You're actually describing my beliefs, though you wouldn't know that because we've never met. But
No, absolutely.
I think the same. I'd never go to church except funerals, weddings and christenings and things like that. Never did go to church. Used to go to Sunday school sometimes, but can't really remember that. It's a few weeks ago now. But there must be something out there guiding and making these things happen. My son and his wife were involved in a similar accident, which was no fault of their own, some probably 3 years ago now. And the only person seriously injured was my son's wife, my daughter-in-law. And she was very seriously injured. The consultant in hospital in East Anglia who treated her said that he happened to have driven past the crash when it happened and saw all the cars involved and thought nobody would survive it. And then the next day he's treating her in hospital for numerous injuries. So these things do happen. And it does make you wonder, is it just fate? Is it just luck? Or is somebody guiding? We don't understand really, do we?
No, and you know, I've one of the things I have come to kind of conclude for myself is that I may not understand these things, but maybe I'm not supposed to. Maybe I'm just supposed to kind of accept and move with them and allow them to do the things that they do.
The other question that comes into mind to me as you talk is you seem to go from logic to no logic, back into logical again. So on the day that you told your wife you were going out for a walk to clear your mind and have some fresh air, where you actually made the statement that you had no intention of ever coming back, something happened to you in the woods and you sat there and you don't know whether it was for seconds or minutes, but when you came out of it at the other end, you knew you weren't going to die. It's a weird mixture. And again, it makes me wonder, is there something out there making your mind the way it is, or is it just a feature of the human brain that we, in deliberating, we make these decisions one way or the other, and it's pure luck where we land up?
I mean, you know, I think there's lots of different viewpoints over the years and the experiences I've had. My view is that there is something that you know, this idea of intuitive guidance, this idea, you know, somewhere deep enough suggests, you know, we should do something or we shouldn't do something.
Yeah.
I think when we follow that, you know, we are led to things that we are supposed to discover or supposed to learn or whatever it is.
We're in a world that we don't and can't fully understand. And hey, welcome to the real world.
Yeah, absolutely.
So now in your piece, you talk about Jenga.
Yes.
So just tell me all about Jenga, please.
So Jenga, you've probably heard of Jenga. Jenga is a wooden block game. I think you've probably seen these wooden block towers. And the idea behind the game is that you kind of remove the blocks without the tower falling down.
Yes, that's right.
But in my personal development journey, so since the accident, since the, you know, coming back from the woods, I really focused on trying to understand myself and why we do the things we do, why we act the way we do, why we think things about ourselves that we do. So why I believe some of the things I did about myself and the world and the way it works. And I spent a long time trying to understand those things and unpick them. And one of the things I discovered along the way was, for myself and other people, there are certain patterns of behavior that we exhibit that have become named. You know, we've given them names over the years. So as an example, things like perfectionism, procrastination, you know, what I call destructive behavior patterns, things that have an impact on our lives and business. Yeah, absolutely. So I was impacted by some of those things over the years. And I really wanted to figure out how I could help myself overcome some of those things. So I was whilst playing Jenga with my family, I kind of had this idea, this analogy came to me that this is just like one of these behavior patterns. So this wooden tower of blocks is just like a behavior pattern. Jenga is built on wooden blocks. A behavior pattern is built on mental blocks. Yeah. You know, mindset issues, limiting beliefs, conditionings.
So the analogy works.
Yeah. And what I thought was, well, hang on a minute. So if I could figure out what the blocks were in my behavior pattern, I could take them away. And if I took them away, exactly the same way as the Jenga tower, the tower would collapse, the pattern would collapse, and I'd be free to be able to not react in that way anymore. So that was the starting point for me. But I discovered two other things in that idea, that concept. One of them was that it also helped me understand why I tried to make change in the past and not actually impacted the behavior pattern, not changed the behavior. Even though I was doing personal development, I was working on myself and I felt better about things, some of my behavior patterns were still there. They were still repeating. And the way I looked at it was, if you imagine the Jenga tower, you can take some blocks away, but the tower doesn't fall down. No. And so I suddenly realized that's why I went to events, I read books, I even worked with some coaches, and I started to feel loads better. But some of the behavior patterns that were impacting me stayed. I couldn't I never overcome them. And what I realized was that's why, because I wasn't necessarily working on all of the blocks or even the right ones. I was just working on some of them.
Okay.
And then the other thing that came to me was, well, hang on a minute. If you imagine the Jenga tower with all of its blocks,
Yeah.
within those blocks, there's probably a dozen blocks that if you just push them out, then the tower still collapses, even if you don't take them all away. And so I thought, well, okay, if I could figure out what all the blocks were, but if I more importantly could figure out which were the 10 or 12 key blocks, the ones that had the biggest impact on me, and I could just work on them, I could compress the time frame for the impact, but also I could have the same end result.
Yeah.
I could still collapse the behavior pattern.
Yeah.
And so this whole idea came to me, and then I started to try and work out, okay, what would the blocks be that support particular behavior patterns?
Yeah.
And then once I'd figured some of those out and created a bit of a matrix for myself, I was then like, okay, how do I figure out which ones affect me? And then I created this idea that we all have our own unique code. So there might be 25 blocks, mental blocks and conditionings that support a particular behavior pattern. But because of our own life experiences, we all have our own unique code.
Excuse me.
That's okay. In other words, some of them might not affect me, and others might affect somebody else.
Yeah.
So I developed this idea that we all have this unique code, this concept that we're all different, but made up of the same Jenga tower, essentially, but just with different blocks. And the more I discovered about that, the more I worked on the blocks myself, the bigger changes I had in my life.
It begs the same question, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And then, as I said earlier, I never had any intention. I never went on this journey with any intention of coaching or speaking or writing or doing anything like that. What happened was, and I say this openly, is that I think there's a lot of pressure on people these days to find their purpose.
Yeah.
And I genuinely don't believe that you find a purpose. I believe a purpose finds you. All you have to do is be open and act when it does. When it shows up, your job is to follow it. And that's when I talked earlier about being intuitive. And so what I realized was I'd gone back, after that, I'd gone back into the corporate world. I'd done various things in those subsequent years, never really finding something that I absolutely loved or enjoyed anymore. I was kind of just wandering from one job to another. But what really struck me was somewhere along that journey, as I started to work on myself, as I started to uncover some of these blocks, started to push these blocks out and collapse these behavior patterns, people started to notice the difference. Their words were, "You've changed." My belief is we don't change. Coaching is not about change. It's about revealing who we really are. So, and they said to me, the first time it ever happened was somebody said, I'm part of a business network. I'd really like you to come and share your story with our business network.
Yeah.
And so I said, yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So I went along. It was only 20 minutes. I just shared what we shared today, essentially, some of the ideas that I had.
Yeah.
And people started to come up to me after that and say, I was really inspired by what you said. I'd love to know a little bit more. Could you help me with this particular issue? I've got a similar problem, and I started to share some things with people. And then what would happen was a few months later, someone would come to me and say, that was amazing. This has happened. I've gone on to do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And it was in those moments, I suddenly realized that now I understand. The question I asked myself in that woodland was, why did I go through all of this? Why am I here?
Yeah.
And now I know this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Yeah. And so I left the corporate world and focused on, helping people who are struggling with those destructive behavior patterns to overcome them and change their life and business depending on what it is that they're looking for.
And would it be true to say you've had way more personal satisfaction in this life, the one you just described, than you ever had in the corporate world?
100%.
Yeah.
As I shared earlier, I've made more money in business and in the corporate world than I ever did in what I do now. But I've never, ever felt the way I feel today in any of the other times of my life.
Well, you've been lucky, because compared to me, you're a young man.
What
I feel, I'm 74 next April, and what I feel is that what I'm doing now gives me so much pleasure, it's untrue. And I've been doing it for about 4 years now. And if I get another 6, I'll be quite happy. But when I tell my children that I'm thinking of retiring when I'm 80, they look at me gone out, as if, because they're in their 40s, and they think, 80? Have we got to work another 40 years yet? I said, well, depends, I'm not working as hard as I used to, but I'm enjoying every single minute of it. And
what's
it's not work, really.
No, absolutely. What's really interesting as well, John, is the number of times I hear people when when I'm coaching or working with clients, or even just in a speaking event, or I hear people come up and say, I wish I knew this information 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I often say, why? What would you do with it? If you knew it 20 years ago, what would you do with it? And they'd say, oh, I'd go out and I'd change this and I'd do this in my life. And I'm like, so what's the difference?
Yeah.
The difference is just in your head, that it's 20 years ago. Somewhere along the line, somebody somewhere decided we were going to put 24 hours in a day.
Yeah.
If someone had decided there was 48 hours in a day, you'd be half the age you are now.
Yeah. There's some logic. We're back on the logic pitch again. Yeah.
And so ultimately, when people say age is just a number, ultimately it is.
It is.
I'm always super inspired when I hear somebody say, I'm this age and I've got no intention of doing, anything other than what I'm doing.
No.
One of my mentors over the years has been Bob Proctor.
Yeah.
And Bob, I think now is off the top of my head, 84, 85.
Is he?
And he openly says, I've got no intention of I will die on stage somewhere giving one of my seminars because I've got no intention of ever stopping. This is all I ever wanted to do.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. When you find that, there's a saying, isn't there, that, when you love what you do, you never work a day in your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it's kind of passed off as being a bit glib and a bit, but when you do find something like that, it's true. That's exactly how it feels. I never think of what I do as work.
No. Well, I masquerade now in the world of social enterprises, and that really is what's made my life complete. And I never shy from telling people that's what I like doing. And, it takes me into prisons. And most of my friends think I'm absolutely bonkers. 2 sons, they both, the first prison I ever went to was a sex offenders prison, and they thought I was absolutely off the wall. What are you doing, Dad? And I won't tell you the advice I got because it's obscene. But I've done it ever since, and I love it, and I feel as if I'm doing something worthwhile. And I think that's the key. And it sounds as if what you do is absolutely magic. Keep on doing it as long as you can.
Absolutely. I have no intention of doing anything else.
Great stuff. Well, listen, Dean, we're going to wind it up now. So I'm really, really grateful for what you've said and the message you've given. I'm enlightened to the extent that it makes me want to do more of what I'm doing, even more. Jenga's a wonderful thing. So can I just say thank you for your time? I'm so grateful, and hopefully you enjoyed it as much as I did.
Absolutely. I always love an opportunity to share and add some value. So thanks for your time, John.
You're welcome, Dean. Cheerio now.